And then I would like to kick off the event. And our first keynote speaker today is Professor Bradley Cantrell, so Brad, who is an landscape architect and a scholar whose work focuses on the role of computation and media in environmental and ecological design. He has held academic appointments at Harvard GSD and Rhode Island School of Design, and also Louisiana State University Robert Reich School of Landscape Architecture. His work in Louisiana over the past decade points to a series of methodologies which develop modes of modeling, simulation, and embedded computation that express and engage the complexity of overlapping physical, cultural, and economic systems. His speech today will feature on adaptive nonsense vocabularies and new wilds. Now, let's welcome Brad. Bradley, please. I will stop sharing the screen. Yeah, please, sharing your screen.
Okay. Can we see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Philip, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be able to speak to everybody here today about my work. I'd like to speak and outline my outlook on the discipline of landscape architecture, and more broadly how computation may shape ecology and the planet. So today I'd like to outline a view of the built environment that I believe is critical to develop as designers in the coming decades. The problems we face are larger than ever before, are embedded with infinite complexity, and are outside of our cultural understanding. Landscape architecture and the landscape itself can provide a sinuous connection between our lives. The architecture we inhabit, the urbanism that expresses our desire, and the environments that sustain our very existence. Most importantly, this landscape, the terra, the aqueous bodies, and the atmospheric envelopes must be reimagined, both regarding how we see and relate to it, but also in how we propose our future. We have positioned the discipline of landscape architecture particularly as a body of knowledge that can design across scales and produce controlled scenarios from the molecule to the territory. But we're still proposing a future based on the praxis that was defined by modernism, a quest for truths and subsequent propositions that are couched in different forms of certainty. So the contemporary environmental condition is one of ecological hybrids, an evolved state where constructed megaliths exist within noisy gradients of the pseudo-natural. These landscapes, hybridized territories, are the product of the exertion of civil engineering, environmental management, and the pressures of urbanization. Where does the discipline of landscape architecture stake its footing in the ecologically complex and technologically abstract realm of contemporary society? To confront the intractable issues of our time, it is necessary to unpack the technologies and subsequent interactions that operate at the scale of the territory. So the interface between the built environment and evolving biological and geological systems requires a blurring of previous strategies to address nascent forms of simulation, sensing, logistics, biological engineering, and technological interface, questioning the dichotomy of the constructed and the natural. It is necessary that landscape architecture takes the stance that designing the territory requires the application of reflexive and responsive technologies and methodologies to propose new infrastructure situated within ever-evolving feedback loops. So the interstitials of these new relationships become the medium in which the discipline may then examine new potentials for construction and maintenance as a starting point to propose new infrastructural landscapes. Once married with, so this is a quote from Kelly Shannon and Marcel Smets. Once married with architecture, mobility, and landscape, infrastructure can more meaningfully integrate territories, reduce marginalization and segregation, and stimulate new forms of interaction. It is at this point that it can then truly become landscape. So this hybridized ecology is a cyborg, positing that the role of landscape architecture is in designing and implementing technologies that promote active and real-time methods of environmental stewardship and management. These methodologies span a range of scales, from micro adjustments of chemical processes, to automated construction, to regional management and monitoring, to global remote sensing systems. Primarily, the concept of a cyborg ecology creates a recursive and/or iterative relationship between computation, biology, and landscape processes. So landscape architecture has long grappled with the material craft of landscape and its subsequent connection with larger territorial systems. These shifts in scale are primarily addressed through hints of connectivity, purported moments where the complexity of the territory is drawn into the scale of the human figure. There is little doubt that the rhetoric permeating the discipline states the effectiveness of the landscape architect as the planner of the territory, particularly as it relates to sociocultural issues, biophysical properties, and ecological fitness. What becomes harder to decipher is how that stated agency manifests itself on the ground, in actionable and nimble forms that live up to the discourse that is developed around process, indeterminacy, and flux. So the discipline aims to conceptualize and articulate the territory as an adaptive infrastructure, the landscape in a state of flux as it responds to changing environmental, programmatic, market, and sociocultural conditions. We can see this through a cynical lens in this quote from John May, where he says, "Our managerial posture demands that all of life be displaced to a condition beyond the natural and the artificial, to an ontological plane where such distinction no longer makes sense and can no longer interfere with the choreographing of matter." This is this quantification of ecological and environmental systems. But this approach places emphasis on the so the approach that I'm putting out places emphasis on the contingent, the provisional, and the conditional, and asks designers to amplify productive instabilities while inventing new types of landscape and form. Therefore, the landscape, physical and ephemeral, formal and indeterminate, is our starting point for the project of generating and maintaining complex environments. So as we talk about this, it's not a project to control our environment. It goes beyond the all-seeing eye of our remote sensing and geographic information systems. Jennifer Gebris has a quote, "If the satellite view has largely been narrated as a project of making a global observation system and seeing Earth as a whole object, then the more distributed monitoring performed by environmental sensors points to the ways in which the Earth might be rendered not as one world, but as many." So within this, landscape has the ability to integrate the environmental, social, and scalar challenges that are at play in the larger territory. Furthermore, landscape architecture absorbs and hybridizes these multiple functions in ways that engineering, environmental science, or planning alone cannot. The medium of landscape also offers operational frameworks and modes of integration that emphasize dynamics, change, and adaptation, mechanisms that are in play in all ecosystems. It's essential to address landscape both as a medium to design and as a mechanism for testing and prototyping interventions that reshape the territory. So rather than understanding medium and mechanism as separate, it's necessary to emphasize hybridizations of systems and environmental dynamics. This would suggest working methodologies that privilege experimentation and iteration, playful and critical prototyping, pathways towards new responsive landscape-based approaches for territorial systems. So human societies have reshaped ecological patterns and processes across the earth, both directly through land use and by facilitating the movement of species, as well as indirectly through pollution and climate change. Even in protected wilderness areas, it has become a challenge to sustain ecological patterns and processes without increasingly frequent and intensive management interventions, including control of invading species, management of endangered populations, and pollution remediation. Further, such interventions themselves may further alter ecological patterns and processes. The planet in the Anthropocene is a diverse and complex landscape, functioning at every scale, crystallized across a static framework of infrastructure, physical and logistical. Canals connecting disparate watersheds, pumps pushing water uphill to defy gravity, pollinators transported for crops, and thousands of kilometers of levees, irrigation technologies, and many other things that repattern entire regions. Our current environment is a literal cyborg of contemporary humanity. The infrastructural framework is bold. It's produced via applied capital to transform the hydrologic, climatic, and ecological regimes of the planet. Its success relies on predictability, models that define the future via abstraction and simplification. So the friction unraveling the planet we occupy is situated where the environmental dynamics of territories confront the stasis of an aging technological, political, and social infrastructure. So to promote a neo-projective language for territorial landscape intervention, it's necessary to understand the influence that infrastructures impress upon landscape systems. Historically, the implementation of landscape infrastructure has relied on a regime fixed by epistemological frameworks. These are verifiable truths that are seemingly self-evident, but most importantly, they're calculated, modeled, and verified as a basis for the proposal of megaliths, infrastructure that is constructed and operates at the scale of large territories. What is unknown in these situations is quickly excluded from the conversation or over-engineered in the need for safety and predictability. Stasis is the defining factor within this modernist framework. It's set, though, within a viscous and vigorous environment that demands change and erases histories. So to operate within this realm requires the embrace of new vocabularies, calculated failure, and forms of adaptation. These are design strategies that rely on adaptation via prototyping, framing the landscape as a laboratory to test the effects of systems at scale. To explore these facets, I'm going to describe a body of work that begins to capture these attributes. In my own work, some of the oldest projects are the most comprehensive, but also the most naive. The more recent projects interrogate specific themes that are present in the older work, in some ways explaining the intuition that was driving these earlier guesses. So I'm going to speak about several projects. Some are a bit more abstract, but are very much about defining these new vocabularies and exploring these concepts of failure and adaptation. So the first one is this idea of failure. So failure in general requires a subject to fail. Without the subject, we are simply discussing processes. This work comes from a series of drawings collaborating with Emma Mendel for the Drawing Codes Traveling Exhibition and the Night Gallery for the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. Drawing Codes was a product of work by Andrew Cudlis and Adam Marcus, and the Night Gallery is by Future Firm in Chicago. What we see is the timeline of human categorized environmental failures over the past 30,000 years. This has been a continual process of humanity expanding its technological prowess while developing rules, instructions, and frameworks for how complex environmental phenomena should interact. These are catastrophic events, but they are also a legitimate part of the evolution of humanity. Our ability to further abstract our complex world and develop solutions to the problems we create has led to a cascading series of failures that are reshaping the planet. The time these failures exist is within the Anthropocene, a human-induced geologic epoch that is the product of our static infrastructural frameworks, sites, resource extraction, and ever-expanding forms of settlement coming into contact with a biological and geological medium that is both dynamic and indeterminate. So reading from our statement for the Drawing Codes competition, failure is at the heart of landscape. environments inherently complex, multivalent relationships in constant flux with indeterminate beginnings and endings. As designers, the dominant paradigm avoids failure, attempting to predict externalities through ever more complex modes of simulation. Complexity beguiles prediction, making it impossible to predict whether or not one unprecedented event is more likely to occur over another. However, it is through the embrace of failure that we develop systems that more readily recover from disturbance, systems that lack fragility and have the ability to respond to unknown outcomes. This requires a paradigm shift. How do we operate in a world that understands it cannot predict a chaotic future? An environment that embraces complexity but rejects predictability. So the application of failure is formed through continual testing, applying stress and digesting the outcome, the product of accumulation and eradication, revisited through irregular schedules, through our own feigned technical competence and our sparks of response. It's a method that has little explanation without post-rationalization, requiring new eyes to determine its history and purpose, like an anthropologist sifting through cultural artifacts. So in this series of drawings we did, we called failure, we attempt to represent the fragility of a single representation. No moment is whole. Each action cannot exist as an entity or contain meaning, formed to the traces of the others, but can be re-related in any order, misaligned, contorted, inverted, or erased. And in this, we dubbed this an anti-method or anti-drawing, coded through the process that we created internally. So in this sense, it's this idea of emergence and this exploration of failure with an emergence to form an evolved form of representation. So complexity in landscape pushes back on our obsession of attempting to find a non-existent order. So this is some kind of writing we've done around this kind of concept of failure and a series of drawing processes and code that we developed to kind of explore these kind of unknowns or random interactions. The second thing I will bring up here is a competition entry, and this is really about beginning to change our vocabulary. I worked on this project with Emma Mendel as well and Fionn Byrne, and we use this as a way to redefine the vocabulary around islands. So rather than drawing the island, we used fungi and mold and chemical reactions to define multiple states. In this project, we ask ourselves, how do we know when a plant has died? And we as a human, we will expire our last breath as our neural activity comes to a halt and the heart discontinues the steady beating it began as we were born into the world. One would think there is no better metronome of vitality than the heart. So in this, we began to redefine this concept of life and death and begin to then use that as a new way to explore the vocabulary around island. So I'm going to read a little bit more from the statement. As this restless muscle finally relents, death takes over. While certainly you understand life and death as a process, you'll have no trouble distinguishing one from another. But the kingdom of fungi demonstrates a most odd hybrid of alive and dead. Having no excretory organs, each cell in a fungus must deal with its own waste. With growth, they build upon non-living material in vacuoles or cell walls. This slow accumulation of death is contradictory to one of our most important dualisms. No last breaths will punctuate the border between subjectivities of alive and dead. So our first redefinition in this project was that of time, the ever-changing relationship between the island and our perception of it as a defined entity. The second definition that we began to question was the one of measure. The boundary length of an island increases with precision of measurement. And this was all about fidelity. Based on the scale it is observed, depending on the scale at which you draw the island, the measurement is infinite. Then the third was scale. The continuous boundary of an island is contingent on scale. Within the island are other islands, spores, porous boundaries, all impossible to define. So ultimately the project arrives at an expansion of our use of vocabulary. And in this, we make the statement, to speak differently allows us to think differently. And this is really about expanding the language of islands and edges into a broader lexicon. Therefore, what the fungi we use to represent the project teaches us is that our representation of the world is limited, divisive, and subjective. Our sense organs act to constantly cleave things from an undifferentiated medium. Our powers of perception fumble to see the unmediated space and time and energy through which we exist. Here in this medium, there are no islands, no binaries, no edges, no objects, no beholders. It's really the way we perceive and describe the natural world, which becomes extremely important as we begin to think about forms of management and the design of ecological systems. So from that, then I'd like to put this quote out for everybody. And this is from Levi Bryant. To be in a world is to be decentralized, to lack all mastery, and to be a participant in an assemblage, network, or composition that exceeds society, culture, and oneself. In this sense, thinking of conceptually about how we begin to flatten the hierarchies that we've developed as human beings in our relationship with the environment. So to have agency in the territory requires tools and strategies that construct an epistemology that is adaptive, an ability to create prototypes that exist throughout the life of a landscape, a feedback loop, and ways to belie hyper-efficiency or control. To create an adaptive epistemology, and so an evolving idea of knowledge, for design, it's necessary to not only adjust our theoretical frameworks, but to also develop new tools for representation, experimentation, and prototyping. This would require us to begin to create laboratories that focus less on empirical data and instead highlight the methods and interventions required to choreograph dynamic landscape systems. These choreographies focus on resistance, producing interventions that disrupt or catalyze ecological systems to produce landscapes that are robust, relying on the concept of anti-fragility, infrastructures and landscapes that produce a heuristic, evolving alongside one another, testing weaknesses and learning to repair, patch, and grow. How might we approach design's agency in an adaptive epistemology? Through a new set of design tools, possibly? A suite of responsive interfaces, interventions, and infrastructures that sculpt, inflect, and choreograph the complexities of ecological systems to develop knowledge that is rooted, but also adaptive. While there's several groups researching these tools, a body of work can be found in my own research over the past decade that originally formed during my time researching infrastructural adaptation in the Mississippi River Delta after the devastating effects of Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. This work attempts to merge the computational prowess of numerical modeling with the tangible tools of physical modeling developed in North America by the Army Corps of Engineers. So to further explore this research, it's helpful to frame the issue of coastal adaptation. If we think about it, approximately 40% of people across the globe are living within 100 kilometers of coastal and riverine environments. This means that 3/4 of the world's megacities and critical infrastructure are situated next to the ocean and will be required to adapt to fluctuating sea levels over the next century. This will be a monumental task for humanity and will require new methods of adaptation, retreat, and construction that are currently outside the scope of our current capabilities. Therefore, it will be important to reimagine how the coast is reformed to provide for the complexity that has been slowly eroded. So this body of research was realized in the formation of the Responsive Environments and Artifacts Labs, co-directed with Professor Alan Sayegh at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. The REAL Lab has conducted research that examines the potential of responsive technologies across a variety of scales, focusing on systems primarily at the territorial scale and the manipulation of indeterminate land building using real-time sensing, robotics, and adaptive management techniques. This body of work has followed me to the University of Virginia, where I'm currently working, and I'm developing collaborations with architecture and environmental science to establish what we call the Open Systems Lab, a university center dedicated to design technologies. Some of the first funded research projects are underway looking at physical modeling methods in collaboration with Ajay Lime in environmental science, and further collaborations to develop methods of heterogeneous forms of algorithmic cultivation. The first modeling projects at the Real Lab utilized a geomorphology modeling table, originally designed in collaboration with Steve Goh at EM River to simulate dynamic riverine and coastal environments. This became the site in which designers at the school and researchers began to develop approaches to fluctuating hydrological systems. The model utilizes 4 sensing systems using ultrasonic range finding sensors, real-time photogrammetry, image analysis, and capacitance sensors to record sediment behavior, surface morphology, and water flow. The geomorphology model is imagined as its own space with dynamic phenomena that is unique to its conditions. This allows the model to be free of attempting to simulate a specific physical landscape or reality. With that being said, there are baseline conditions derived from prototypical geomorphological tropes, such as delta building, meandering rivers, backwater swamps, and tidal zones, among others. The modeling space creates a tangible environment that can generate a huge range of conditions. These conditions are created using synthetic sediment of varying sizes and densities, pumps to create stream flow and groundwater flow, and an adjustable bed that can set lateral and longitudinal slope as well as depth. These variables can be altered to set the initial conditions and also controlled over time. The controls on the table allow the researchers to program hydrographs for both stream flow and groundwater flow, creating flow input profiles that are repeatable. The media feeders can create measured mixes of sediment that are inserted into the water flow, and there is also an injector that can introduce dye plumes into the flow, helping to visualize helping to visualize water movements. The varied synthetic sediment sizes and densities self-organize based on water velocities, resembling a range of particulate matter from an abstraction of large gravel, or yellow, which would be in yellow, to a fine silt, which is in red. It's actually not on this slide. In coordination with the modeling elements, the modeling space also has a sensing system that allows for the researchers to gather data on surface morphology, flow rates, sediment moisture, and image analysis. Using ultrasonic sensors that measure distance, the system can move the sensors across the table to record precise spot elevations as well as continuous sections. Using a Microsoft Connect, it's also used to record a continuously updated point cloud of the surface. Combining these, it's possible to derive a precise real-time model of the surface at multiple levels of detail. The controls and sensors allow the model to deliver a broad range of fluvial landscape scenarios with consistent seeding parameters. The overlay of sensing technologies allows for the acquisition of data to experiment with methods of visualization, analysis, and interaction. The model is more complex than static models, but it's important to acknowledge that it's also an abstraction that generalizes fluvial landscapes. These are just some images from some of the software we developed in order to visualize the data that was being recorded from the table. So this work, this research, it advances a form of, it's a project that holds great promise for how we engage large-scale environmental change, engaging highly dynamic systems and utilizing their energy to compose new terrains, which provides a mechanism for massive change with minimal input. The feedback between sensing systems and landscape modification forms a construction methodology that is tunable and challenges methods of complex simulation and static infrastructure. Using the real-time digital models, the researchers are then creating devices that respond to the changes in the physical model, such as robotic sediment gates, repositionable sieves, and flow disruptors. The intent of this exploration is to develop prototypes and a design language that enables designers to create novel hydrologic landscapes that are tied to sense phenomena and forecasting models. The current scope of the work provides a proof of concept for an emerging tool set to engage the world at this scale. The tool set relies on real-time sensing, but it's also coupled with methods that are formed around adaptive management to produce closer relationships between landscape analysis and subsequent methods of construction. Conceptually, this proposes a method that relies on designing operations that intervene locally but aggregate to produce territorial change. Most importantly, this is a form of landscape choreography that continually learns from itself by processing the results of its actions before choosing the next intervention. It's a continuous call and response between biological systems and an active infrastructure. So to produce these interventions, research has taken different approaches. As I mentioned before, this is really about like using this model and the data generated from it to create responsive prototypes. And this is, then about managing the product of those interactions. This is a project by Tyler Moore and Andrew Boyd called that is really examining how indeterminate landscapes might be represented and managed. So an important step in this work has been to develop a range of motion within the infrastructural interventions and to then document their influence. Using image analysis to record subsequent iterations, this documentation illustrates a formal design language addressing indeterminacy. Producing topographic plans that speak to movement and probabilities of change. The illustrations highlight a landscape form that expresses areas of stasis and flux, forming a gradient of interaction between the two. Furthermore, the work of Leif Estrada utilized the lab to explore how the Los Angeles River Channel may be deconstructed and reconstituted as a composed and managed riverbed with a highly developed urban fabric. So categorizing the materials of the deconstructed Los Angeles River, the work proposes the reorganization of the demolished channel using the energy of high water moments in the river. The approach utilized a series of individually controlled insertions into the sediment that redirect the graded material from the demolished channel. So assuming that each material has its own performance and its interaction with the hydrology, it's then choreographed to produce a range of riverine landscapes. The new riverbed is the product of interactions that guide outcomes. Most importantly, these outcomes are controlled within a range, and their aggregation is a consequence of the current hydrology while projecting a series of future goals. So these distribution patterns are analyzed and calibrated to produce these novel habitats for a diverse series of species, including humans. So, essentially deconstructing the river system and then using these high water moments to repattern the downstream condition. And within that, using the kind of indeterminate outcomes to guide them towards these ecological systems. These are dynamic and evolving systems, each with their own temporal dimensions and physical expressions. You can see in this image a choreographed redistribution of sediment and materials as the infrastructure moves up the river channel, deconstructing and redepositing in each annual flood cycle. So, within this, ideally the work in the lab really examines the idea of tools, right? And so it goes beyond kind of forms of documentation that we use in landscape architecture. The work produced helps to enhance the tool set of the architect and landscape architect and develop design approaches that utilize this ever-expanding command of computation. Proposes a method of intervention that collapses representation, analysis, documentation, and the construction process. This requires a tactical approach to landscape formation, relying on the design of operations that rest within local observation, sensing, and as I mentioned before, long-term forecasting. And so this is, this kind of tool set is one that I've been, and others have been exploring recently as a way to begin to think about how we might approach these highly complex riverine systems. So in this, it's the feedback between sensing systems, machine intelligence, and landscape modification that creates a construction methodology that is tunable and challenges ideas about simulation. The goal is to move beyond our known representations and design methods and develop the tools necessary to address these current global conditions. From this idea, we can identify 4 methods for establishing an adaptive epistemology that engages the material landscape. The first is this idea of micro-modifications, bottom-up processes such as eutrophication and soil catalyzation, made up of slight localized alterations, resistances, and shifts across multiple operations. The modifications are tuned for a range of scales and read as gradients within the larger landscape. So this is kind of 4 kind of ideas about engagement. First one being this idea of micro-modifications. The second is the celebration of novel relationships created and monitored based on evolving methods of simulation and machine learning. These relationships curate new ecologies based on performative pairings and evolutionary trajectories. This method creates relations that format, predict, reorder, or nudge systems in unknown directions. While these may be system-wide changes, it is assumed that they would be emergent, functioning as predictors of the unknown, tested and altered to suit our current conditions. The next is this idea of what I would put out as called temporal exploitation. It's the manipulation of systems across both the micro and macro timescales to respond in the moment to long-term goals. So this method views time on a continuum where each modification references historical data while simultaneously speculating on future trajectories. It's also this, this ability to essentially begin to slightly speed up or slow down different types of landscape systems. And this is a kind of a concept that's embedded in landscape architecture that I believe is extremely important in this idea of ecological management, and particularly through this idea of through computation. And then the last one here is this idea of phase manipulation. It refers to the intentional intersection between entropic processes and actuation to shift these trajectories. So this manipulation is expressed through small shifts rather than complete state changes within systems. For example, the alteration of water velocity or the liquefaction of soil substrates. So from this, we can see one attempt to develop new tools for design, tools that form a new relationship between landscape process and construction methods. And so I think so hopefully there's like a bit of a trajectory there in terms of tools and the new processes that they enable in terms of how we interact with landscape systems. Just looking at my time, okay. So that body of research is very much about tools, and there's a kind of range of things going on in that realm. As I mentioned, there's a lot of other folks working in similar ways. But in another body of research that I've begun to develop, and this is work with my colleague Earl Ellis, an ecologist, and Laura Jane Martin, an environmental historian. We explore the potential for fully automated management systems within the environment to create and sustain new forms of wild places. We use this term wild places without ongoing direct human intervention. And we talk about this in a paper we published in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. This paper is called Designing Autonomy, if anyone's interested. So from this, I'll read a little bit and then kind of talk about some examples. So recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence have produced systems capable of solving complex problems through algorithms in which the rules of behavior are not derived through programming, but through evolutionary processes of machine learning. This is probably obvious to everyone on this stream. Most of us know the story of AlphaGo and the deep learning approach that it used. It's learning from games played with itself to defeat the world's top-ranked human player in Go. It's a game long believed to be so complex as to be intractable to computing. At many points, I think what's most interesting about this as an example, at many points, AlphaGo deployed innovative strategies. Thus, the prospect of intelligent systems capable of acting autonomously in real time to sustain the autonomy of non-human species and ecological processes without direct human intervention appears increasingly possible. Indeed, machine learning methods are increasingly used to develop species distribution models that inform conservation decisions, identify and monitor unique species, analyze existing data sets, and then among many other applications. Importantly, conservation biologists and managers are also employing deep learning systems and other technologies to eliminate, counter, or mitigate anthropogenic influences on species and ecological processes. So essentially using forms of machine learning in order to kind of separate the kind of human or anthropogenic and natural system divide, right? And to set up this kind of artificial barrier between those interactions. So for us, to explore the potential of automated systems for sustaining wild places, we began by reviewing the concepts of wildness and autonomy. We then introduced a framework for describing different levels of automation, and we linked these to levels of environmental management. The highest levels of automated environmental management were then explored through the speculative design of an automated infrastructure, and we call this a wildness creator. This creates and maintains what we're saying are wild places independently of humans. As with self-driving cars, these automated technological systems for environmental management are rife with practical challenges and ethical dilemmas. Indeed, fully automated systems may ultimately prove both impractical and unethical. However, the prospect of fully automated environmental management raises important questions that designers, ecologists, and conservation biologists must address in their efforts to enhance non-human autonomy in increasingly human-managed ecosystems. I put the question out there, and I think it's one that should come up right away. Can wildness even be created by human beings? And when we use this term wildness, we're really talking about systems that are perceived or are outside of human influence or control. And I think there's a whole range of things to debate within what I just said, but I'm trying to simplify this for the point of this discussion. So the idea of creating wildness is not new. In the 1920s, for example, and this is just one example, American ecologists developed the idea of creative conservation. And Harshberger concluded that ecologists may reproduce nature so closely by the use of native plants that our fellow humans are deceived and believe that they look upon a wild growth when it is in fact artificial. A few years later, ecologist Edith Roberts and landscape architect Elsa Raymond described how to garden so as to leave the woods absolutely natural and seemingly untouched. Indeed, for nearly a century, landscape architects and restoration ecologists have sought to intervene in landscapes in such a way that mimics wild nature or facilitates its autonomous recovery. And there's a host of projects out there, and this is, once again, in no way exhaustive at all, and just to give you some examples, but there's a host of projects already shaping ecosystems through semi-automated strategies that enhance the autonomy of non-humans. And I use the word enhance, but they actually also do the opposite of enhance other species. So wildness is an unusual design challenge that is fraught with contradictions that are technical and formal, as well as cultural and philosophical. The design of wild places has usually aimed to preserve the historical character of regions, establish the picturesque, and to curate human experiences harking back to a period before modernism. However, to design is inherently a human act, an influence in itself. To design a space free from human influence therefore requires a distanced authorship, favoring process, curation, and choreography. Such design from a distance would need to allow ecological systems and wild populations to co-evolve through their sustained interactions, sustained by an infrastructure operating beyond human control or interference to continuously promote non-human autonomy and counter human influences. So the point we try to make in this is that we are already at a place where the natural environment is often a cultural construct of humanity, and the perception of the kind of control or lack of control of those environments is a large part of the way we understand the world around us. In many ways, we are moving towards a space where computation is playing a greater role in the management of those complex environments, and the product of that management is moving towards a realm where we don't quite understand the decisions being made by the infrastructural or the management infrastructures. What that produces then are landscapes that are the product of machine interaction and the biology or the geology itself, and that environment is inherently perceived as wild, particularly if we don't quite understand the management protocols or what exactly is occurring. An example of this is the hotspot, and this is I won't say this is a direct example because the work and the research that I'm talking about goes much farther than this. But the idea of the hotspot, this is the crown of thorns starfish bot, and this has been deployed in the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. And the hotspot is an interesting example that is essentially moving across the Great Barrier Reef and using image analysis to basically find crown of thorns starfish. It's then when it finds one of the crown of thorns starfish, it uses basically a probe and injects it with a bile solution to kill it. The crown of thorns starfish is an invasive species, or considered an invasive species that's basically eating the coral reef. Interestingly, the crown of thorns starfish is there because there's extra agricultural runoff from the deltas, but at the same time, what we end up with then is a management system where we have an autonomous drone moving through the ocean and using image analysis to find these species and actually as a predator putting them down so that they don't continue to eat the coral reef. So we have a predator who's basically is a human management protocol. Right now, obviously, it's using a series of instructions that are easily understandable, and we can understand the kind of consequence of that. But I think we can all imagine very quickly how different decision-making processes might completely change the choices a robotic management system like this might take. So if we talked about this as a larger system, and we think we already have forms of semi-autonomous ecological management, you can imagine then the idea of this creation of wild, what we could call wild or what seem to be unmanaged landscape systems. If these kind of if these managers were unseen and we weren't kind of in direct, our knowledge of its actions weren't complete. As with current efforts to naturalize restoration decisions, the prospect of wildness, creating wildness that is perceived, comes from this idea of the machine as gardener. It concedes decision-making to non-humans, the machine intelligence, rather than confronting humans with difficult, complex, and political decisions in environmental governance. So you can imagine in some ways that you can almost offload environmental decisions to a system like this. This work has been important to develop as it outlines a future for our relationship with the environment that is a direct trajectory offered by our current forms of automation and guided by our further implementation of different types of machine intelligence. This speaks to a couple things, and as I mentioned before, this kind of design of operations. It's important to begin to really frame the importance of protocols and the design of the interactions that govern systems. And these are two quotes by Galloway and Thacker, but this idea of protocol is twofold. It is both an apparatus that facilitates different networks and a logic that governs how things are done within that apparatus. It's important, it's not simply about the creation of optimized systems, and there's a concept of resistance that's also important. So This idea of protocological control fosters the creation and regulation of life itself. In other words, once again, I'm quoting here, in other words, the set of procedures for monitoring, regulating, and modulating networks as living networks is geared at the most fundamental level toward the production of life in its biological, social, and political capacities. So the target is not simply protocol, rather, to be more precise, the target of resistance is the way in which protocol inflects and sculpts life itself. So in this idea of resistance becomes important. How do we begin to use protocol as a form of resistance? And how does that then begin to sculpt and reflect these natural systems? Am I doing okay on time, Philip? Just another few minutes? Sorry, I can't hear you. Maybe you're. I have one more project to talk about, and then we can maybe do questions. Does that work? So finally, I'd like to end on a multidisciplinary project. So this is the one at the very beginning of the talk. I mentioned that this is one of the older projects I've done, but it had a lot of these kind of same kind of ideas in it that you can see have been kind of extracted and explored through these much smaller projects. And this is a project with the Louisiana State University Coastal Sustainability Studio, and a collaboration with Elizabeth Ann Williams, Jeff Carney, and Matthew Seibert. It's a year-long funded project and is recognized by several awards. So to jump right into the kind of definition of the project, embedded within the sands and silts of shifting coastal surfaces, multi-scalar relationships across urban cores and their outskirts render vibrant socio-ecological landscapes, incorporating gradients of population, industry, investment, and regulation that stretch of the shore between Houston, Texas, and Mobile, Alabama. This presents one of the most vulnerable mega regions throughout the entirety of the United States. And within this urban economic expanse, the Tri-City Delta landscape between New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Houma Thibodeau has evolved to maintain significant cultural and industrial value. The central wetland of Louisiana is embedded within an expansive web of resources. And this project, which we call Synthetic Mudscapes, speculates on the potential of alternatives where human occupation effectively strengthens environmental resilience in the face of sea level rise, subsidence, coastal erosion, and increased storm frequency. So in order to defend infrastructure economy and settlement within the region, it was essential to reestablish a rapidly disappearing landscape by constructing new land to alleviate increasing risk. Links between urban environments and economic drivers have constrained the dynamic deltaic soils for generations, now threatening to undermine the ecological fitness of the entire region. In order to found a resilient, layered mitigation strategy, 3 distinct land building practices provide an arc for transforming these systems. So these were 3 ways of rebuilding land and on sites in the Delta. So at the Isle de Jean-Charles Crescent, dredge material and drill cutting debris are deposited and then continually deepen transport lanes for an expanding oil fields. It's a high diversity and concentrated seeding is dispersed to sustain land growth. The other is along the outlet of the Mississippi River levee system. This is near the Myrtle Grove diversion, south of New Orleans. Releases sediment and sifted landfill material transported from the river basin, and it's really accelerating natural land building processes. And you can see this kind of underlying form that begins to take. And the third is really about nutrients being, and their kind of entrance into Lake Pontchartrain, and redirecting those to help regrow coastal ecologies. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll be quick here. But this is very much then about beginning to use this kind of actuation of sensing and monitoring, and kind of the continual building of knowledge about a landscape system. So, really what we began to imagine was this kind of underlying model that would begin to be built from the environmental data that was being input into it. This was, once again, about 7 or 8 years ago. And so in this, we were thinking that this would be this kind of ongoing, almost library of environmental data that begins to help us manage each of these landscape conditions. Within that then, with this diagram, it's really then about kind of moving up and down this idea about management and investment, and how we begin to think about how parts of land are maintained as open water, how they become active as accumulating sediment, might then become healthy wetlands or established land that could begin to form as kind of infrastructure or areas for settlement. And if it's essentially moving up and down this kind of diagram based on political or economic moments in time. So in this then, really thinking about how these three sites are kind of emergent from their own kind of physical conditions, but also sitting under the umbrella of kind of economic and political pressures. So I'm going to kind of close down from this, and maybe there'll be some questions. But as I mentioned before, what I'm trying to begin to develop in my own work, and I think many others are as well, is thinking about how we begin to kind of alter our design methodologies, alter our engagements with the physical world in order to really dive into this concept of the intractable problems that we're facing, the complexity of those issues, and the kind of fault of our previous deployment of infrastructure and other large-scale systems. So thank you all for this opportunity. It's a real pleasure to present this to you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone.